Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're so thrilled today to be joined by the wonderful Siddiq Saunderson to talk all about Wu Tang and American Saga. And I wanted to start by diving back to when you first auditioned for the show, because you didn't necessarily know that Ghostface was the character and the person that you were going to be portraying in the show. And I was interested in that in terms of how that actually really helped you to go into shaping a character and really just focusing on the scripts and the raw version of who he was being written to be, because obviously you're playing this character who's incredibly renowned and incredibly well known, but you're playing him at a stage in his life when that wasn't yet the case.
Yeah, so like you said, I originally went in, and it was Dennis Cole's aka D Lover at the time when I first got the audition, and I was like, I know that there's a lot of people in Wu Tang. I never heard of nobody named D Lover. This might be a character, that I think I was like stuck on the D Lover part being like the rap name. And I was like, I think that this might be a character, you know what I'm saying? That's like a new, or somebody that I've never heard of from the clan or whatever. But I think that it kind of worked to my advantage. I knew that it was a character from New York, and being from Brooklyn, I was able to kind of tap back into that energy that exists when you're from here. And so, went in there, did the first couple. I think my first round is when I didn't know, and I just kind of really based all of my acting and the decisions that I was making for the character on what was in the script. Which is just how I learned, from school how to act anyways, like start with the script and what's on the page. And then from there, you can kind of build and make your own decisions and stuff like that. But yeah, I think that had a lot to do with why I was kind of starting in the right direction and ended up eventually getting the role, was because I was honoring Dennis before I was trying to be Ghostface Killer. So
And it sounds like a lot of the elements of research that you did included looking at what were the influences, what were musicians that he was listening to when he was that age, what were the comic books that he was reading. And so how did delving into a lot of the culture that he was consuming when he was younger really help in shaping this fully formed version of him and really just getting such a sense of his entire worldview as a character?
I think that, yeah, like you said, like that was just my process. I didn't, I think a lot of people, especially fans of the show, because they are fans of Wu Tang, kind of have this expectation that, I was immediately like a fan of Ghostface and like, oh, like kind of started there, when in reality, I approached him as any character that I would approach. And like you said, like what was he listening to at the time? What blues singers and the kind of oldies that he was listening to. Like you said, the comic books, I definitely went into, a shop and picked up, the earliest Iron Man comic that I could find and just brought it to with me on set and had it sitting there. And sometimes, when there would be, especially on the first season, when there would be time in between setups or whatever, I would pick it up and just read it and see how I felt and how that made me feel. Because I think that all those little things really play into kind of the psyche of a person. And in order to play somebody, you have to really understand their psyche. You have to understand their essence, what they're drawn to, before, again, you try to tap into the thing that they are outwardly to a public audience, especially because a lot of the times that's very different than who they are behind closed doors. So I was really trying to figure out that part first, especially because he wasn't referred to, like Ghostface Killer didn't even exist, within the first season. It was he was still going by D Lover and stuff like that. So yeah, just like really trying to figure out those little like details and those little nuances that made him him, and introducing those into my world so that I could really capture the essence of who he was at that time.
Because of the way that you were just describing how obviously there's the public persona, but that's not who he is in what we're seeing in the show, was it helpful at all to look at some of the early interviews with him and get a sense of how he talked about certain things and then really think about how you wanted to strip that down to a more kind of internal version of who he might be when he's not on camera?
Yes, absolutely. Also, you're asking amazing questions, by the way. But yeah, I think that all just really helped with laying the foundation that I think is so important, because it has such a great payoff that, this season people can now, this is the first time he introduces himself as Ghostface Killer and what that means, and the changing of the name from D Lover and, to Ghostface, and kind of playing on again, like that journey that we all go through as people. I think I wanted to try to keep him as human as possible, because to a lot of people, you know, he is beyond. But that would not serve me as the actor playing him to be a, you know, a super fan and kind of like looking at him as this like, you know, other figure. I kind of really had to like ground myself so that I can see the person that was right in front of me and the person that I was portraying.
Yeah. And it also sounds like one of the useful things as well was looking at how other people were describing him and the way that they were talking about him, because from my understanding, you didn't get the opportunity to have a conversation with him right off the bat when you were filming the first couple of episodes. That came a little bit later, but obviously you have RZA working on the show and the opportunity to look at how other people were describing his personality and describing different traits. And so from those types of conversations and that side of your research, what are some of the traits that you carried into him as a character in the show?
Well, for one, I mean, and you can see it from the first scene of the pilot episode in season 1 is, you know, he's a family man and he really is loyal, and, you know, he really rides for the people that he rides for. So that's why there's an immense betrayal that he feels, that kind of when Bobby is, you know, messing around with Sha, you know, when RZA is messing around with Raekwon in the first season, which through the second season you see the development of that relationship, especially between me and Raekwon, and again, it all kind of centers around family, which is something that I very much can relate to. I know that when we were doing season 2, it's not too much of a spoiler. This is actually a really small detail, but there's a point where I have a piece of sandwich, and we're in a rehearsal space and I'm sharing the sandwich with everybody. And I remember mathematics telling me that, you know, like, no, that's really how he was. Like if he had a piece of the sandwich, you know, anybody who wanted a piece, he would rip off a piece and everybody could eat off of that. Things like that, you know, things like speaking to RZA and really just trusting that, you know, when he gave me the head nod, like that I was right in the pocket. And that to me is, you know, just as valuable, I think. What the people who are not anybody, but people who are genuinely close to another person, what they say about you, I think is also good information, because sometimes, you know, as yourself, you want to give just the good parts. You know, you're not so quick to tell maybe some of the parts that you want to hide or you feel insecure about, or you want to change. But having somebody there who was so close to him kind of give me that, like, go ahead, made me feel confident to do the first 3 episodes. And then eventually I met him around the ending of filming the 3rd one. And then everything kind of locked in from there.
Yeah, and you were bringing up that idea of family being so important to him, and the show does such a wonderful job at really fleshing out his story and getting us to see so many aspects of his home life, and wanted to start with that aspect by talking about his relationship with his mom, because that's been a really interesting dynamic to see how that plays out, and the fact that he really was someone who had to take on kind of a secondary parental role to his brothers, because of his mom struggling with alcoholism at the time, and you know, her being a single parent. And through the 2nd season, we're getting to see this space in which they're almost peers to each other now that he's become a father himself as well. And so that's really shifted and evolved the dynamic. So how have you set about wanting to really portray not just what that relationship dynamic was like when he was younger, but what it's starting to look like as he's becoming, you know, more of an adult and more of a peer to his mom as well?
I think that feeling of maturity and growth happens throughout all of his relationships in the 2nd season. I think it's really, you know, dope that you're asking about the parental thing, because that's not even something that I necessarily thought about. I just know that, like, going into the 2nd season, I was like, okay, you know, Dennis is now a father, and like, what does that mean? And prioritizing certain things over other things that he was prioritizing in season 1 because of, you know, his responsibility that he has to take care of his, you know, of Sheree and the new baby. So I think that those things all kind of went into play with how I was reacting. But yeah, specifically with, you know, with my mom in season 2, which, you know, she has some, she comes in for a little bit, but there is a lot of time spent without her. But I think that, like, kind of revisiting and coming back to New York and having the scenes where I am with my family, it felt very different. And it also felt different because, you know, we just came off of 2020 where everything was shut down. And so kind of having that time for myself, I think, and then coming back to it, that reuniting feeling is very authentic because it's how it felt before the cameras were rolling. And so that kind of, you know, hopefully I think it translated, you know, and people will see that in the show, that it feels like a kind of homecoming.
Yeah, I also really love how much we get to see his relationship with his two younger brothers and his two younger brothers who both have muscular dystrophy, and one who's nonverbal and one who's verbal. And I just think there's so much heart between that relationship dynamic where it is an interesting space, again, where he's their older brother. He's also a parent to them. He's also a caretaker. But also there's so much comedy and so much humor within that dynamic as well. And I really love kind of like the rapport and the riffs that happen between them. And so how did you find all of the different spaces and complexities, but also, you know, the beautiful humanity that you really wanted to bring into that relationship for him?
I think it's because it's very me. I have two brothers myself who are both young. You know, so I know what it's like to be an older brother. I have a lot of younger cousins as well that you know, growing up, I was the oldest one. So that came pretty naturally. And also, you know, just working with Sam and Amir was just a pleasure because they were just really cool and we vibed kind of instantly. It felt like, you know, we were there looking out for each other and so I think that was kind of just like a natural progression, just because, again, like that is very much who I am. I'm very much a family man. You know, growing up, we did a lot of like family vacations and stuff like that together, or like sleepovers at grandma's house. So that all felt very natural. And also, you know, having responsibilities, I'm used to having like a lot of responsibilities and a lot of people say I feel more mature than the age that I actually am, but that's because I've kind of lived a lot of different lives in a very short period of time. So yeah, I think the complexity of this character, and I say this character also because there are some parts within the story that aren't 100% accurate to his life, which is another reason why I thought it was really important to look at the script and look at what my task was, which my task is to be him, yes, but also to tell this story that Hulu and the writers' room and, you know, everybody has decided to tell. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of things that run parallel between me and the real Ghostface, and also me and Dennis, because I think that's three separate kind of entities.
Yeah, and that maturity that he carries at home within his family is also something that we then see carrying through into the way that he approaches his work as an artist, and even down to the fact that a lot of his trepidation into, you know, going and being part of the band, it comes from that idea of I can't be messing around with something that is a rigged system that isn't a guaranteed success and is most likely to fail statistically. And he's really thinking very conscientiously and very intellectually about that decision. And it's actually Sheree who's the one to be like, you have to go try this. And so for you, was it always very clear that she was kind of that tipping point? And how did you want that version of who he is in his home life to then start carrying over into how he starts to approach the industry?
I think that there was just a moment of, you know, back against the wall, you know, like in season 2, you really see Dennis. I mean, and you see it in season 1 as well, but his back is against the wall because there's just, again, the responsibility of having this child, you know, finding a spot to live with Sheree and the baby, to raise them, to buy the crib that she wants and buy food and more Pampers and all of these priorities that he has, that he then has to kind of really think about what's important and think about the risk factor of a lot of things that I think he didn't really care about season 1, you know? So yeah, I think that Sheree was definitely a tipping point because of, you know, it's her. She's, you know, at the top of the priority list, her and the baby. So if she's telling me, you know, maybe you should take a chance, maybe you should think about it. And I don't think that Ghost is too, I don't think that he really doesn't think that he can make it. I think that he's just would rather go after something that he sees is as more stable than something like a rap career, you know. But then it takes this major thing happening, this major shift of having a child and the perspective of the world kind of broadening to like get him to take that leap of faith
Yeah.
that he's always kind of secretly wanted to take anyway.
Yeah. And in speaking of Sheree as well, I wanted to talk about your work with Zoe Griggs, who plays the character, and kind of looking back to that very first chemistry read that the two of you did together when she'd already been cast and you were stepping into the room, and how for the two of you that started to really shape a lot of that dynamic, that intimacy, that closeness, and just that really intrinsic rapport that the two of you have together on screen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I remember meeting Zoe. I remember meeting her in LA, and yeah, I was just like, oh, okay, this is the girl. There was one other guy that was there, and he had gone in the room. I think he was in the room when I first came, and then he came out and was like, "Good luck," and I was like, "I'm gonna get this." I'm sorry, but this is mine now. I've already kind of claimed it in my mind. And then going into the room and reading with Zoe, everything just kind of clicked. It just was like very natural. She was super calm, which kind of calmed my like nerves, my like last round nerves that I was feeling. And yeah, she's just really easy to work with. We kind of really bounce off each other and introduce. It's just natural. It's not something that we really had to kind of cultivate. It was just like there. And then I remember the last thing of that chemistry read, which was the final round, was they were like, okay, let's take a picture of you two. And so I like just put my arm around her, and I remember looking in the camera and being like, this is it, it's me, and then I got the call. So
I also really like that we've gotten to see the evolution of what that partnership looks like. And particularly early on, Dennis was all in, but there was that moment where he just didn't necessarily feel like he could give her what he felt like she deserved in the world. And even just things like looking at the fact that she's incredibly literate and that's not his specific dynamic, his skills are in other spaces, and him seeing that as an unequal partnership and him not being able to provide, what she has in her personality. But that's also why it works so well between the two of them. And, there was that really powerful moment between the two of them where he tried to push her away. And that actually felt like that ended up bringing them much closer together. And obviously, as parents now, it really comes across as a real partnership of equals. And was it important to the two of you to always eventually shape it into exactly that space where we get to see it now in the show?
um again with Zoe, it's just what it is. Like I don't think we had that many conversations about what specifically like, again, I think trusting the script, because there are things that you're bringing up that I'm like, oh yeah, I like low-key forgot about that happened that way. It just was like a natural progression. But as you're speaking, I'm remembering the first time I took her to the Italian restaurant, and we felt uncomfortable to then go to have that moment where I'm like, maybe you should go with somebody that reads, and all these things that kind of happened. But I think, again, for me and Zoe, and then for Sheree and Dennis, there's just this I got you, you got me kind of thing going. And so when we are together and we do have the scenes together, and we have some really great scenes in this upcoming season, it is just that love and that loyalty and that bond of like, I got to make this work. Dennis, I'm like, I got to make this work for us, and she's doing that in her own right. And I've, like you said, there's been that progression of her own personal growth, and mine as well. So I think that we're both kind of like growing together. We're growing separately, but because we are together and now have this child together, there's this collective growth that's happening between us.
Is that the same as the dynamic as you found with the rest of the cast, particularly when you look at actors like Ashton that you're working with on the show and the relationship with Bobby? Because they come into the show from the very first scene. There's such a history between, Dennis and Bobby and many of the other characters. And we really get this essence of, the idea of the show being about this brotherhood and this idea of extended family really existed from the very first scenes in the show. And was that similar to what you were saying about working with Zoe, where it was just a really natural dynamic, or were there certain conversations that you all had about some of their backstory and some of their history leading into it when you started the show?
I think we all did our own story, creation and our own, we laid our own groundwork, and then we would come to set and then just live in those circumstances. Was the process, that we went through. But yeah, I mean, I think we all have different types of relationships, and I'm closer to some people behind the scenes than I am to others. But I think, again, what makes the show so beautiful is that a lot of those dynamics were already kind of written in to to the show. So it was, they were kind of honored as we continue to film, and especially like me and my relationship with like Shameik, where first season, we didn't necessarily see eye to eye about certain things. It wasn't like a huge like clashing, but I didn't really work with him that much. We didn't really, when we see each other, it was kind of like short or whatever. So that kind of that made that whole like beefing thing really easy, because it was like, it is what it is, But now for season 2, we have a lot of great scenes together and great work that we do, shout outs to Shameik and Ashton as well. But Ghost and Raekwon, like that him shooting at my house was such a major plot point for me in the first season. So it's really exciting. I'm really excited for audiences to see that relationship develop in particular. The one with Bobby is very similar, and definitely has its own growth. But me and Bobby, have always been kind of, 1 and 2, back in, we had that. I looked out for him. And then when I felt like he wasn't necessarily looking out for me, that's when that tension occurred. And that will always kind of be the dynamic. But to go from a dynamic of a shoot, my house being shot up by, Sha, Raekwon, and then eventually where we end up in season 2, I think that's definitely a relationship that, and through that within the script, me and Shameik have developed a great, off-screen relationship as well. So, yeah.
And when it came to also really shaping his voice as an artist and a musician, was that a case of really studying, a lot of stage performances and really looking at a lot of the mannerisms and listening to his voice, because you're having to shape the way that he moves and, what he does with his hands when he's performing, and also the specificity of what he sounds like as well. So there's so many different elements that come into that performance side of things.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I definitely want to shout out. I went to Carnegie Mellon. That's where I got my acting training, and we have this project in our first year called Icons, where we pick 3 iconic figures, and then we kind of like take a monologue and perform the monologue as them, but from specific scenes, and try to get their voice cadence and their body language and everything kind of like perfect. So that is essentially what I'm doing on this show. Like all that work that I did for this one project, freshman year, is is now my job, for this show. So, I mean, absolutely. I think that, in his regular speaking voice, we have different, cadences. His voice is a little bit higher pitched than mine, especially when he's rapping. So there was a point where I was really stressing over it and trying to, but then I had to kind of let that go, because I was like, well, I want to give an honest and authentic performance. I don't want it to sound like I'm putting on a crazy voice. So I'm going to go as close as I can without it sounding like, I'm doing something else. But for sure, body language, I, watched a lot of interviews. I noticed, where he would look off and down, out the, to the left side, and kind of touch his beard a certain way, or scratch, like when he scratched the back of his neck, and how he would kind of stutter on certain phrases when he got past, like all those things kind of, I really studied and I kind of wrote down and I practiced them off camera. So that way, when I would go to screen, it was just kind of like within, the character and within the world. And I just could kind of live in that truthfully. So yeah, definitely, it took a lot of work. It's really interesting too, because my love for, performing has all to do with my ability to create characters. So this is a little bit of a different, thing, because I am playing somebody that's real. So there's this like groundwork, but I'm also still trying to figure out how within that groundwork I can make my own decisions that'll inform, certain character choices and stuff as well. So it's been really great. It's been really great.
I love the way that you're describing that journey and that you brought up your degree at Carnegie Mellon, because I heard you talk about it and describe how one of the reasons why you're so glad that you studied is that element of developing tools so that when you're working on a character, there's that ability not just to come up and construct who they are from the scripts, but there's that ability to be able to pivot details. So exactly what you were just saying about finding his voice as a performer. And so were there other moments in the show as well where you started going down a particular avenue or trying to find the character in certain ways, and then you realized that actually it needed something different from you?
Um, yeah. I think that, well, what I would say to that point is that I think it got to a point in this, especially within season 2, where I just had to trust myself and trust the work and trust that people believe me, are ready to be Dennis, to be, eventually become Ghostface. People are there. And of course, you got the 1 or 2 haters that's like, that ain't that. And it's just kind of like, okay, I can't please everybody. I can only do my job. But I feel like, yeah, like trusting and relying on my process, trusting and relying on my skills and my toolbox, especially when it's time to like rap, because this season we have, we recreate some of the songs, some of the most iconic, Wu Tang songs, Protect Your Neck and Cream and stuff like that. So it's like, that was a point where I was really like, okay, this verse exists in real life, and how can I get my voice to sound as close to how his sounds for the song in particular, so that way at least I can check. That was really important to me. And so that required me going into the studio, and even when they were like, nah, we got it, I would listen. And if I heard one little, I would go back, and it required me to go in there and do some of my vocal warm-ups that I learned from school, because if not, my voice would be shot by the end of it, because of how different the pitches of our voice are, the timbres of our voice are, and all that stuff. So I did have to dig into my toolbox to kind of create some of these moments. But I think that those moments paired again with the moments that maybe don't sound 100% like him, but have the same essence or the same kind of tone, or the tonal pattern within his voice. I think all that together, people will buy into the fact that I'm playing him, which is, what I'm doing. So
I think audiences are really going to love seeing all the different spaces that you've brought him to as a character through your performance this season. And thank you so much for sharing all of this with us, Siddiq.
Thank you for having me.